Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another video. So today's video is going to be another self-roast. I'm going to be talking about misconceptions that I had about writing craft. So I've pulled 6. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. We could definitely go a little deeper into that archive, but we're just going to keep it to 6. So these aren't misconceptions I had about like writing process, and it's also not mistakes that I made. Like if we wanted to just talk about writing mistakes I made, we'd be here all day. These are mistakes that I made, but specifically, like, these are things that I was doing consciously, which makes them much more embarrassing. It's not like, oh, you know, I was trying to do this, but I didn't have the skill. Like, these are things that I consciously was trying to do in my work, and I thought made good writing, but don't. Like, I genuinely thought this is what you were meant to do, and I was purposely doing these things. My first misconception about writing, I've talked about this before. I thought that good dialogue meant replicating normal human speech patterns as closely as possible. And so when you read my old work, the number of ellipses that I used, ridiculous, because every single time when I was imagining my characters talk, every single time the characters would pause or say like an or something, you know, like how people talk normally in a very flawed manner. Basically anything that you would edit out of a video. And I would include all of those things, all of those kind of just like verbal quirks that people just naturally have in their speech. So many ellipses, oh my god. Because I thought that that was good dialogue. I thought good dialogue was as realistic as possible. And in truth, good dialogue, when you're reading it, you think it's realistic, but it's not actually realistic, because if you were to take a transcript of a regular conversation, it has so much mess to it, and you want to cut all of that out. You don't need to have an ellipses every single time someone would realistically pause while speaking. That's one reason why my old dialogue was so bad. I still don't consider dialogue to be my greatest strength. It's probably the area of writing that I think I'm at least the least confident in. Like, I'm not very consistent with my dialogue. I don't consider dialogue to be my strength by any means, but it used to be way worse because I was trying to make it as realistic as possible, but it was just so messy to read. My second misconception about writing, I think, is a little related, and it's that I thought realism was the ultimate goal in all scenarios. Sure, sometimes realism is the goal. Sometimes your goal is to write something that's completely realistic. But good fiction isn't always about realism. And I would get so caught up in things being realistic that I lost sight of what was interesting. And especially considering the fact that, like, I was 15, so my perception of what was realistic was not exactly well-tuned, but I would include so much like redundant stuff because it was realistic. Replicating reality perfectly doesn't always have to be the goal of good writing. Sometimes you want to take the more interesting route, or you want to take the route that maybe isn't as perfectly realistic, but it's just a better story. Sometimes you have to edit reality for the sake of good fiction or good drama, and a lot of the time people won't notice that it's unrealistic, or if it's done intentionally, it still makes a good story. I talked a bit about this in my video on realism in fiction and like the different planes of realism. It's okay to edit reality for the sake of good storytelling, and I used to prioritize what I thought was realistic over good storytelling rather than the other way around. I think there's definitely a way to make a good story that isn't as realistic, but that's okay. That's kind of why we're telling a lot of stories, because they're, to a certain point, weird or unbelievable. My third misconception was about character development. And I used to feel that if a character had a clear personality to me, then they were a fully developed character. Like, I really thought character development ended at personality. That's not always the case, and one thing that I was completely lacking in terms of character development was specificity and concrete detail. I've got an entire video on specificity, I'll leave a link to that in the cards, but I was completely lacking this really important part of character development, which was concrete information. Details about the character, like concrete details about the person, and because I was fully prioritizing personality and I felt like that's what led to good character development, and that's really all you needed. Who cares if we don't know anything about them or what they do? They have a clear personality that is clear to me. And sure, personality is great. It's usually not a good sign if you're reading a character and they don't really have a personality, but there's more than just that, and I didn't know that. Number 4 is a range of points, and it's that I just didn't understand how point of view worked. just on a fundamental technical craft level, I did not get point of view. And to be fair, I think a lot of people don't get point of view because point of view is really complicated and the way they teach it to you in high school English class is really oversimplified. So a lot of people don't really have they've never had the education in how point of view works. So I don't take full responsibility for this one. Still, I really didn't get how point of view worked. There's a bunch of them, but I think the main thing is that I saw point of view as a choice rather than a tool. I thought it was just about choosing whether my book was going to be in first person or third person, and that was it. I didn't really understand it as a very flexible but complex tool that you could utilize. Some of the other misconceptions I had about point of view, I wrote them down. There were many of them. For example, I thought that the third person narrator wasn't the character's voice. So if you have a third person narrator, I didn't really understand that psychic distance was a thing. If you're writing in third person, to me, that's not the character, that's not the protagonist's voice. It still is, just through a different vessel. I was wrong on that. I also thought that all thoughts should be in italic. This is like one of the cringiest things about my old writing. It's probably not the cringiest thing to readers, but it is to me. Because I didn't understand that a third person narrator and the protagonist were kind of like the same entity and how blended they were, anytime a character was thinking something, I would put it in italics in first person, but the word, I find this embarrassing. It's probably not actually. There are way more embarrassing things about me than the fact that I used to put thoughts in italics, but you know, I'm easily mortified by my own existence and history. But I would do this in first person too. Like, I really didn't understand how point of view worked clearly, because I would have a character who was thinking something in first person and I would put the thoughts in italics when it's like, it's first person, so everything they're thinking is a thought, especially because it'd be present tense. I'd be writing in first person present tense and I would put some thoughts in italics because I guess to me some of the narrative was a thought, and I don't know. I did this up until like a pretty embarrassing age. I did this until I was like 18, 19. I also thought that third person meant it was harder to get attached to or invested in the character. To be fair, a lot of articles claim this. There's a lot of misconceptions about point of view out there, but a lot of articles do say that it's harder to get invested in a character in third person. So I really believed that that was the case, and I was like, I wrote everything in first person when I was younger because I didn't really understand that third person also had benefits, because the articles would always say it's easier to get invested in a character in first person, so I'd always write in first person. I love both. Look, I still love first person, don't get me wrong. It's still like my one true love, but I love third person too. I love writing in both, and I didn't really understand the benefits of third person at all, partly because I had so many misconceptions about third person and how it worked. I also thought that third person was for like more mature literary works and that first person was more immature, which like I wrote in first person, so like this was a self-roast. Like I was like, first person's more immature, guess I'll use it for everything, which by the way it's not. First person is not more immature, and I really thought that third person was for more like literary works, and that's not true at all. A ton of literary fiction is in first person. Like that's not a thing. That distinction doesn't exist. I also just thought that like third person present tense wasn't an option. Like I just thought it was something that there was no reason to write in. It didn't even cross my mind, and it's one of my favorite point of views now. I love third person present tense. It's one of my faves, but I didn't see the point. So my next misconception that I had about writing: so more emotion is better writing. I really just piled it on. When it came to feelings, less was not more. I really thought more was more, and then even more, and then even more. My work was so melodramatic when I was young, when I was a teenager, because I really thought that's what good writing was. As much feeling as possible that we could pack in, let's go. No, actually. I thought good endings were as sad as they could possibly be. Have I really changed? I didn't understand subtlety at all. Everything was so overt and everything was so over the top because I really thought that that was like good writing. Peak emotional intensity at all moments. What was subtlety? I didn't know her. And that's just not true. Sometimes the most emotionally poignant pieces are the most emotionally subtle. Like sometimes I'll be reading something that's like so emotionally subtle, and that's why it's so powerful. And there's nothing really overt. The characters don't have any overt emotional reactions. Sometimes it's really subtle emotional reactions that are the most impactful. And my final misconception that I had about writing is that I thought that all my protagonists should be likable and relatable. And look, they totally can be. There's nothing bad about that if that's your goal. But they don't have to be. I have a much more complex understanding of protagonists now and characters, and I used to be more focused on the character being likable than anything else. One of the simplest but biggest revelations I ever had about writing was the most important thing is that it's interesting. Maybe this is a bit of a blanket statement, and sure, you can probably find exceptions, but in general, it being interesting is really the most important quality. More than it being realistic, more than it being the character being likable. I'd rather read about a character who's likable or interesting. I'll take interesting. Would I rather read about a story that's realistic or interesting? I'll take interesting. As long as it's interesting, I'm on board as a reader, no matter what else that means for the most part. And that definitely is true for characters. I'm really glad my understanding of protagonists expanded, because I love writing deeply unlikable characters. That's actually like my favorite thing to write, my favorite type of character. I love unlikable people. Garbage humans are what I'm about. It also really set me free as a writer, because even now when I'm trying to write a character that's more rootable in like a more kind of traditional way, I don't really worry about that. I don't get stressed about whether or not they're likable. They are what they are. They will be as likable as they end up being. As long as that they're interesting, I really think that's the most important thing. As I have gotten older and I've shifted away from my older style of writing to writing more the style of work that I write now, I definitely much more shifted to a point where the things that interest me the most about characters are their flaws rather than their strengths. That has definitely made me a much better character writer. You know, obviously it's like the most classic writing advice ever. Your characters should have flaws. When I was younger, I definitely saw it more of just being like a list of traits. Like your character has some good traits and they have some bad traits. And now I really approach character flaws like, what's the core conflict of the character that I'm exploring, and why is it interesting to read about? And that's way more interesting than just kind of slapping on like a label and being like, this character's a little bit arrogant or something like that. So those are 6 misconceptions that I had about writing. I'm sure I could think of more, but this seems like an adequate amount of self-roasting for the day. Let me know what misconceptions you had about writing craft in the comments. It will make me feel much better about myself. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.